Glasgow sprawled under a January sky in 1919, a city of soot and steel hugging the Clyde's muddy banks. Trams rattled through streets thick with coal smoke, their bells clanging over the din of shipyard hammers and factory whistles. Tenements loomed, gray and damp, their windows flickering with oil lamps as dusk settled in. Mairi Fraser slipped out of the textile mill, her shift done, hands stained purple from dye vats that once churned out khaki for the war. At 22, she was wiry and quick, her dark hair pinned loose under a cap, eyes sharp with a fire the drudgery couldn't snuff. She dodged a cart piled with coal sacks, boots splashing through puddles, and headed for the Black Bull pub where Tam waited. Inside, the air hung heavy with tobacco and sweat, workers crowding the bar, their voices buzzing with talk of shorter hours and better pay. Tam Kerr sat by the hearth, his policeman's coat unbuttoned, a pint half drunk before him. Back from the Somme, he was all lean muscle and quiet scars, 25 but aged beyond it, his hazel eyes softening only for her. Mary slid onto the bench, pulling a battered notebook from her coat. "Wrote something new," she said, voice cutting through the clamor, and he leaned in, a faint smile breaking his guard. She cleared her throat, words spilling out like molten steel. "The Clyde runs red with iron's blood, a vein slit wide by toil's cruel flood. We weave their wars in thread and flame, yet reap no peace, just rust and shame." The room stilled for a heartbeat, men turning from their pints, her lines slicing through the haze like a blade. Tam's hand found hers under the table, rough fingers squeezing tight, and a grizzled riveter clapped her shoulder, muttering, "That's the truth of it, lass." She grinned, fierce and fleeting, but the weight of the words lingered, a spark in the pub's restless air. Talk turned to the strike brewing, thousands ready to walk out, demand a 40-hour week, shove it in the boss's faces. Mary felt it too, a tide rising in her chest, and Tam's grip tightened, his duty tugging him the other way. Next morning, the city erupted. Whistles fell silent as workers poured from mills and yards, Mary among them, her voice hoarse from chanting in George Square. Placards bobbed above the crowd, "Fair work, fair pay," and the air crackled with defiance. She caught a glimpse of James Dornan, the shipyard magnate, watching from his motor car, his tailored suit stark against the grime. His face was all angles, eyes cold as the river, and they locked on her for a moment too long before he drove off. She shook it off, marching with the throng. But that night, alone in her tenement room, something shifted. The walls creaked and a sound crept in, not the usual drip of a leak or the wind's howl, but a low metallic murmur, like hammers tapping steel in the distance. "The thread breaks soon," it rasped, faint and sourceless, threading through the dark. Mary sat up, heart thudding, chalking it up to a tired mind, but the words stuck, echoing her poem's bite. The strike swelled over days, rallies clogging Glasgow's arteries, voices rising in a roar that shook the tenements. Mary stood on the picket line, breath fogging in the chill, her notebook tucked close as she shouted with the rest. Tam patrolled the edges, his uniform a wedge between them, his jaw tight whenever their eyes met. The murmurs came again one dusk, sharper now, a chorus of whispers from the mill's brick walls. "He binds us still," and she froze, ears straining. Dornan's name slipped from the voices, low and bitter, a thread she couldn't unpick. At the factory gate, she found a crumpled letter half burned in the mud, its ink smudged but clear enough. "Bolshevik agents among the strikers, proof enclosed." Her gut twisted, it stank of a lie, a plant, and Dornan's cold stare flashed in her mind. She cornered Tam at the pub that night, the letter clutched tight, her voice low and urgent. "This is forged, Tam. Someone's framing us, and I'd bet my last shilling it's Dornan." He frowned, scanning the page, then shook his head, his tone clipped. "You're seeing shadows, Mary. The brass wouldn't dare." The whispers hissed again, faint under the bar's din. "Mary, Mary!" And she flinched, shoving the letter at him. Listen, damn it. Something's off, and you know it. He pushed it back, standing abruptly, his pint sloshing. I've got orders, not hunches, he snapped, and left her there, the echoes of the forge humming in her ears, pulling her toward a truth she couldn't yet name. Glasgow's January chill deepened as the strike stretched into its second week, the city a cauldron of noise and nerves. Mairi Fraser stood firm on the picket line, her throat raw from chanting, the forged letter a crumpled weight in her coat pocket. The textile mill loomed behind her, its windows dark, its machines stilled by the walkout. Workers packed the streets, their breath clouding the air, placards swaying like banners in a war they hadn't named. She scanned the crowd for Tam, his policeman's cap a speck among the blue coats holding the line, but his eyes dodged hers, his jaw set hard. The echoes of the forge hummed low in her ears, a metallic buzz weaving through the shouts. He binds us still, and she clenched her fists, Dornan's name a burr she couldn't shake. That night she slipped back into the mill, the gate creaking under her touch, the yard silent but for the wind rattling loose tin. Her boots echoed on the concrete, heart pounding as she climbed to Dornan's office, a shadowed nook above the dye vats. The forged letter gnawed at her, a lie to crush the strike, pin it on reds, and she needed proof. Inside, the room smelled of ink and cigar ash, a desk piled with ledgers glinting under her flickering match. She rifled through papers, fingers trembling, until she hit a locked drawer. The echoes swelled, a chorus of rasps. There! There! And she froze as shapes flickered in the corner, vague figures in welders' aprons, faces charred or crumpled, pointing at the lock. With a hairpin and a curse, she popped it open, pulling out a stack of photos. Blackened bodies sprawled in rubble, a 1916 factory blast, dozens dead, hushed up for war profits. Dornan's signature sprawled across a memo, production above all. Her stomach turned, the echoes hissing, blood for gold, as she stuffed the photos into her coat. She slipped out, the mill's silence pressing in, but the streets beyond churned with strike fever. January 31st dawned gray and tense. George Square packed shoulder to shoulder, a sea of caps and shawls roaring for justice. Mary wove through, the photos afire in her pocket, aiming to find a union man who'd listen. Tam stood with the police cordon, truncheon in hand, his gaze catching hers for a splintered second before the crowd surged. A baton cracked against a skull, a bottle shattered on stone, and chaos erupted. Strikers clashing with coppers, hooves thundering as mounted men charged in. She ducked a swinging arm, the air thick with yells and dust, when the echoes broke loose. From the cobblestones they rose, spectral workers, their aprons smoldering, hands mangled or burned, voices a howling hymn. Blood for gold, blood for gold. The cold snapped sharp, horses rearing as if stung, policemen stumbling back, their shouts drowned by the ghostly roar. Mary's breath caught, the crowd parting around her, and she saw Dornan on a balcony above, his face calm, almost amused, as if he'd expected this. The echoes turned the square into a storm, tools clattering unseen, a wind whipping through that wasn't there, and she bolted, clutching the photos, slipping past Tam's line as he hesitated, truncheon limp. Back in her tenement, walls damp and peeling, she spread the evidence on her cot, the echoes fading to a hum. Tam burst in, uniform askew, his voice rough. What the hell's happening, Mary? Saw you in the square, then that madness. Horses bolting, men screaming. She thrust the photos at him, her words sharp. Dornan killed them, Tam. Blew up a factory for profit, covered it up, and now he's framing us. Help me stop him. He stared at the charred faces, hands shaking, then shoved them back. You're mad. This'll get you locked up or worse. The echoes whispered again, low and close. You carried our shells. And Tam flinched, his war scars tightening his face. I carried enough in France, he snapped, storming out, leaving her with the ghosts in a choice. The flat felt smaller, the air sour with coal dust and fear when boots thudded up the stairs. Dornan's men kicked the door wide. Two bruisers in flat caps, their knuckles scarred. "Stirring trouble, eh?" one growled, snatching her notebook, tearing poems to scraps as the other upended her cot. The photos stayed hidden under her coat, pressed to her ribs, and she spat back, "You'll not scare me off." They laughed, rough and hollow, smashing her chair before lumbering out, a warning carved in the wreckage. Alone, she sank to the floor, the echoes soft now. "He binds us still." And she knew the square's chaos was just the start. Dornan's grip tightening, her fight barely begun. Glasgow shivered under a bleak dawn, the strike battered but not broken, its echo lingering in the frost-crusted streets. Mairi Fraser sat hunched in her wrecked tenement, the photos of Dornan's 1916 factory dead spread before her, her torn notebook a scatter of shredded verse. The echoes of the forge hummed soft in the walls, a metallic lullaby. "He binds us still," and she straightened, jaw tight. Dornan's men had trashed her home, but not her will. She salvaged a pencil stub, scribbling the truth onto a pamphlet. His war profits, the explosion cover-up, the forged Bolshevik lie, her words sharp as a blade. By first light she slipped out, dodging patrols, and handed the pages to a printer's lad from the strike, a wiry boy who grinned fierce and promised to run them off. The city stirred slow, trams clanking through mist, workers nursing bruises from George Square's clash. Mary headed for Dornan's shipyard, the Clyde's iron heart, her coat heavy with the last photos. The echoes rose with her steps, a chorus of whispers. "Now, now," guiding her through alleys thick with coal dust and dread. She found him in his office overlooking the cranes, James Dornan in a tailored suit, sipping tea like the world bent to his whim. He looked up, eyes cold and steady, as she slapped the pamphlet on his desk. "It's done," she said, voice cutting the quiet. "Your lies are out, and the yard'll know it by noon." He leaned back, a smirk curling his lips. "Words won't topple me, lass. The Clyde bends to my hand, not ghosts or rabble." The room shuddered then, a low groan rolling through the floorboards, tools clattering in the yard below. The echoes surged, spectral workers spilling from the walls, smoldering aprons, crushed hands, their voices a howl. "Blood for gold!" Machinery screeched, a crane swaying wild as if tugged by unseen hands, and Dornan's tea splashed, his calm cracking. Mary stood firm, the air snapping cold around her, the ghosts a storm of rage she'd unleashed. "They begged to differ," she spat, and he lunged for her, but the echoes pressed in, shadows flickering fast, holding him back. Shouts echoed from the yard, workers storming the gates, pamphlets in hand, their roar a tide breaking loose. Tam burst through the door, uniform shed, his face flushed from running. "Mary, get out! Yard's gone mad!" He grabbed her arm, pulling her past Dornan, who slumped in his chair, eyes wide as the ghosts faded, their hymn softening to a sigh. They stumbled into the chaos, strikers smashing crates, foremen fleeing, the air thick with salt and steel. Mary clutched her coat, the photos safe, and Tam led her through the fray, his grip a lifeline she hadn't expected. The yard burned with defiance, but beyond its gates the city trembled. Tanks rumbling in from the square, government boots stomping the strike's last gas flat. They fled north by dusk, the Clydes clanged behind them, hitching a ride on a coal lorry bound for the highlands. Dornan's empire teetered, his name muddied by the pamphlets, but the strike crumbled under steel and law. Its leaders nabbed, its fire snuffed. Mary sat quiet in a glen that night, a fire crackling between her and Tam, her salvaged notebook open on her lap. The echoes whispered one last time. "Rest now." A faint clang on the wind, then gone, their justice carved in the words she'd set loose. Tam watched her, his scars soft in the glow, and she penned a final line, pencil steady. "The forge sings soft, its chains unbound." She shut the book, the city's roar a memory, and leaned into him, the silence vast and theirs alone. Weeks later, Glasgow limped on, the strike a scar on its skin, Dornan's shipyard limping under scrutiny. Mary's pamphlet lingered in pubs and mills, a spark that wouldn't die, though the 40-hour dream stayed out of reach. In the glen, she and Tam built a quiet life. Her poems whispered to the hills, his hands free of truncheons. The Clyde's ghosts slept, their voices stilled, but the wind carried a faint echo some nights, a hammer's tap, a worker's sigh. Reminding her of the thread she'd snapped, the forge unbound by her stand,